This week we're going to be talking about rocks. Now, not just about rocks, but we're going to be talking about how rocks go from being one rock to another, right? Or what we call the rock cycle. Now, last week we talked about sediments, okay? Now, sediments, they can form into eventually what we call sedimentary rock. And over time it gets compacted, becomes sedimentary rock, and then over even longer periods of time, if we put even more pressure onto it and more heat, then it'll start to become what we call a metamorphic rock. And then that metamorphic rock will get hot enough, it'll get pushed down to the mantle and it'll heat up and it can melt and become magma. That magma will come back to the Earth's surface to become lava and then cool to become igneous rock.
And then that rock is weathered to become sedimentary rock, and then that rock is compacted and heated to become metamorphic rock, and then it's melted and then cools to become igneous rock,
and then that rock is weathered to become sedimentary rock, and then that rock is compacted and heated to become metamorphic rock, and then it's melted and then cools to become igneous rock, and then that rock is weathered to become sedimentary rock, and then that rock is compacted and heated to become metamorphic rock, and then it's melted and then cools to become igneous rock, and then that rock is weathered to become
Now, as you can see, this cycle can go on for extremely long periods of time. In fact, this is always happening. Because there's these three types of rocks, you'll notice that there are features to these rocks that are different across each type. So I have a few examples that I'm going to show you of each type of rock, and then we're going to do a quick drawing of the rock cycle. Now, this first kind of rock that I'm going to show you, this is a sedimentary rock. In fact, this is sandstone. As you might be able to see, this sandstone, especially along these edges here, you can't feel it, I can feel it. It's a little bit rougher, but you may be able to see that there are some grains. Now, in a sedimentary rock, we say that the grain size is relatively larger than in, for example, metamorphic rock. Now, those grains, you can imagine that those are the actual little pieces of rock, those actual little pieces of sediment, right, that eventually over time gets compacted and cemented together to give us this sedimentary rock. Now, like we said, over even longer periods of time, if we add enough heat and enough pressure to a sedimentary rock, for example, it can give us a metamorphic rock. Now, what I have here is marble. If you look closely at marble, you'll notice that it might look a little bit different than sandstone. The grains are so small that you almost can't see. And that smoothness is caused by the fact that the grains are much smaller than they were in the sandstone or in the sedimentary rock. And that's because of all of the pressure that's pushing onto that sedimentary rock. Once that metamorphic rock can melt and become magma, and that magma reaches the Earth's surface to become lava, and that lava cools, that gives us an igneous rock. Now, igneous rock looks much different, and that's because it has almost these little holes in it, right? Which were actually air bubbles that were in the lava, that as the lava cooled, those air bubbles were still there, and they escaped and left that hole behind. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this rock cycle. Now, obviously you've learned about the rock cycle before, you've learned about the different kinds of rocks in grade 4. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the rock cycle, but more specifically we're going to emphasize how we go from one type of rock to another. Now, as we go through the rock cycle, I want you to focus especially on the processes that allow one rock to form into another type. Make sure you're in section C of your handout, and we're going to start in the top left. And what we're going to start with is we're going to start with just basically a pile, and pretend this is a pile of sediment. Now, we know that sediment is those little bits of rock that can come off due to erosion, right? Different kinds of weathering that's going to cause rocks to break down. Now, like we said before, as that sediment is deposited, maybe deposited by a river or deposited by a wind, over long periods of time, that sediment is going to stack up on each other, and it's going to start to compact. And it's going to give us what we call sedimentary rock. So I'm going to do a quick drawing of sedimentary rock. But what's significant about sedimentary rock is that it's typically layered. Oftentimes when you look at sedimentary rock, you'll notice that there's distinct layers, especially when you're looking at a large geologic feature like a mountain. Now, it's important that we signify what process is creating this type of rock. So let's make sure we add that to our picture. So sedimentary rock is going to be formed from sediment as it's compacted and cemented together, and that cementing is happening pretty much just because of the amount of pressure that is being applied. Now, if there's longer periods of time where there's a lot of pressure on, for example, sedimentary rock, and especially if there's a lot of heat being applied, then what we're going to find is it's going to start to form into metamorphic rock. So let's make sure that we make note of how this sedimentary rock is becoming metamorphic rock, that with a lot of heat and a lot of intense pressure, we can eventually turn sedimentary into metamorphic rock. Now, what if that metamorphic rock is pushed even further into the lithosphere, eventually to the mantle? Well, it's going to melt and it's going to become magma. Now, what if that magma eventually reaches the Earth's surface again, becomes lava, and then it cools? Well, that's going to give us our igneous rock. So what process is igneous rock being formed through? Well, it's just the cooling of magma. Now, in order for this to be a cycle, we've got to finish it off here. So how does igneous rock become sediment? Well, that's going to happen due to weathering and erosion. But is this the only way that a rock cycle can work? Can only igneous rock become sediment, and then can only sedimentary rock become metamorphic rock? Well, let's take a look at this. We know that if igneous rock is weathered and eroded, it can eventually become sediment. But why can't that happen to metamorphic rock? Well, it can. So over time, metamorphic rock can actually be weathered to become sediment as well. But what about sedimentary rock? Absolutely, the exact same thing can happen. Now, can only metamorphic rock melt to become magma? Absolutely not. Igneous rock could do the same thing. So even though we call it a rock cycle, there's not just one way that it's going, right? It could jump from being a metamorphic rock to sediment, to sedimentary rock, back to sediment again, and then sedimentary rock again, and then maybe metamorphic, and then magma, and then igneous, right? Back to sediment, and then sedimentary rock. You can jump around all over the place. But these are the basics of our rock cycle. It's really important that you understand the processes that we wrote down in red here that are along each arrow. How does one type of rock become another type of rock? Now, that's everything for this lesson. So good luck with the rest of your work for week number 5.